Donc je suis heureux d'accueillir le professeur Arato pour sa 3e conférence. Comme lors des précédentes conférences, je vous rappelle qu'il s'exprime en anglais, mais que vous pourrez lui poser vos questions en français. Il les comprendra sans difficulté. Voilà, je lui laisse la parole. Je vous rappelle à tous que la 4e et dernière conférence aura lieu la semaine prochaine à 14 h dans cette même salle. Andrew, please.
Thanks very much, Professor Rosanvallon. As I already said the first time, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to present these ideas. Today's lecture is called Hegemony, Insurance, and Post-Sovereign Constitution Making. I try to make it a little bit shorter than the others, and so I will try to speak also slower to make sure that there are no great problems with my Hungaro-English. In my last lecture, I presented post-sovereign multi-stage constitution making as a synthesis of American-type convention and French-type constituent assemblies, with normative as well as functional advantages over both of these forerunners. What I did not discuss are the empirical conditions of possibility of this model and its connection to the consequences of constitution making. I did mention, however, that since the 1970s, this method had 4 significant cases of success, as defined by the enactment and endurance of constitutionalist constitutions, namely Spain, Poland, Bulgaria, and South Africa. I spoke of 4 cases of failure or partial failure: Czechoslovakia, the German Democratic Republic, Iraq, and now Hungary. This mixed track record could be explained focusing on the problems of statehood and process completion. I will try to do that next time. There are 2 ways that normative and historical analysis like mine can go seriously wrong. One of these would assume that the results of my analysis are available without paying attention to interest and motivation. This is the issue that I mainly wish to consider and redress today. The other error is imagining that alternative solutions of the same problems would not have been possible and perhaps equally likely. This, as I will show next time, would reduce the applicability of the paradigm I'm stressing because of its path-dependent nature. In order to fully present my approach today, I would like to set it off against 2 social science theories, 2 American social scientific theories, which go under the name of hegemonic preservation and insurance. These theories are complementary to mine to the extent that they focus on empirical origins or conditions of possibility, as well as quality and endurance of the results. These issues are important for me as well, and I would like to bring them in my normative historical presentation so far. This will allow me also to test approaches contradicting mine in whole or in part. Conversely, social scientific theories, having long cast off the huge shadow of Max Weber, can easily assume that satisfying the empirical conditions of origins and survival, the problem of legitimation can be dispensed with. In the last part of this presentation today, I will try to address that error and use the theory of post-sovereign constitution making to deal with it. So the first of the theories in question is Ran Herschel's. He's an Israeli legal scholar teaching at University of Toronto. It has the advantage that it focuses on a relatively small group of seriously examined cases, in part distinct from mine. It also has the virtue or defect, we will see which, of offering a diametrically opposed type of explanation to mine in terms of models. For him, constitutionalism is the result of a type of imposition. For me, constitutionalism, though not constitutions in general, is more often the product of negotiations that my post-sovereign model insists on. The other current social scientific theory, American social scientific theory on offer, is the work of Thomas Ginsburg and his collaborators, originally involving another group of distinct cases, but extended to the study of constitution making and preserving in the largest possible data set of countries. It has the advantage of having an implicit normative scheme that can serve as a bridge back to my conception. The problem is, however, that Herschel and Ginsburg, the two approaches, overlap to an important extent, not only in their rational choice methods, but also in some of their conclusions regarding cases. I will make an attempt to separate them around three polarities: concepts of conversion of power versus guarantees against power. Second, the idea of monistic versus pluralistic constitution making. And third, non-legitimacy versus legitimacy. Rand Herschel has polemically titled his conception juristocracy, and more helpfully as hegemonic preservation. In terms of his cases, 4 common law heritage countries, namely Israel, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and also Turkey and the European Union, the first term, juristocracy, is a vast exaggeration. In none of the cases can it remotely be said that judges rule. Hegemonic preservation is a much more interesting and defensible concept. The idea is basically that constitutionalism, in a sense of limits on majority power, emerges where previous power holders are pessimistic about the future and seek to guard important advantages against future majorities. Herschel speaks of 3 elites in this context: political, economic, and legal. But only the first, namely political power holders, matter for the explanation, because he pretty much postulates that capitalist interests, as well as lawyers and judges in general and almost everywhere, support at least economic constitutionalism based on the defense of property. Thus, the key thesis is that hegemonic political elite in each setting, having a clear understanding of an adverse future, is willing and able to impose a constitution to shape that future. Even Herschel's depiction of the obviously negotiated South African case appears as mostly the work of previous hegemonic white Afrikaans elite, with the parties of the black majority effectively neutralized. Herschel tends to define constitutional democracy in terms of entrenchment, in other words, moderate to difficult rules of amendment, fundamental rights, and their judicial enforcement. In this we largely agree. But while he didn't try to make this argument entirely general, it is his distinct implication that such a system is more likely to emerge from imposition by power holders than any other process. That's where we disagree. Whatever we think of Herschel's actual analysis of cases, the hegemonic preservation argument, abstractly at least, is logically coherent and significant. And the logic is seemingly reinforced by lots of historical cases he does not even treat. While it is certainly plausible that the heavy entrenchment of the U.S. Constitution in Article 5 is to be chalked up to federalism, as Dicey already maintained, there is a potential argument even here that its high level, very high level, was meant as a protection against possible national majorities at a time when it was the number of states rather than people that really mattered. The introduction of judicial review 15 years later could also be interpreted as a rearguard defense of the Federalist minority already eclipsed politically. Closer to our time, as in a once famous Stein-Rocken thesis, the introduction of proportional representation by the bourgeois parties of Northern Europe can be very well interpreted as a shift to an electoral system more capable of preserving the status of old parties than the first-past-the-post majoritarian schemes that have prospered before universal suffrage. Finally, in 1980, under the leadership of General Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, political institutions, among them a very strong constitutional court, were put into an imposed constitution to help preserve over time some of the powers and advantages of the rulers and beneficiaries of the dictatorship. Similar concessions were imposed by military leaders elsewhere, most explicitly by General Evren, the leader of the coup in 1980 in Turkey. Thus, something very much like hegemonic imposition seems to exist, whether or not Herschel's own cases support this conception. Let me focus on cases that seem to support it. I believe that these very cases either contradict the full thesis of hegemonic preservation because they do not lead to constitutionalism, or lead to solutions compatible with constitutionalism only because of important considerations Herschel has neglected. What they do not sustain is the idea of the authoritarian origins and undemocratic nature of the package of entrenchment, constitutional courts, and their enforcement of fundamental rights. I think it can be shown that what seems to be hegemonic preservation has a constitutionalist outcome in the context of political support and pressure by forces other than the hegemonic elite, on normative or empirical grounds, and not when this is absent. Of these, normative grounds are moreover superior because they can appeal to forces and interests that are originally not main partners even in constitutional bargains. The US Constitution, for example, was a highly negotiated product that was thoroughly discussed and debated in the public spheres of the states. Article 5 may have already been seen by some as a very high threshold for democratic constitutional politics, but during the first Congress it was used to make 10 amendments to the Constitution in line with the demands of its opponents. As I argued last time, it was the amendment rule, not as entrenchment, but as tool of revision, that allowed the stage demanded by the anti-federalists to be added to the process. In 1795, the same rule was even used to trump a decision of the Supreme Court, Chisholm v. Georgia. Instead of being seen as undemocratic, Article 5 was first experienced as a democratic opening and method of improvement, especially in context of a previous rule of change that required unanimity rather than only 3/4 of the states. Finally, while the resistance of judges in the 1800s was indeed to democratic politics that could leave the older system behind, it was their minimalism that allowed them to succeed as against an early failure following Chisholm. Moreover, while Jefferson and Madison could and did oppose what they regarded as judicial overreach, they could not very well go against the Constitution, namely their own work, the Bill of Rights being part of the work to which Jefferson himself contributed. The establishment of the system of the early 19th century, hardly juristocracy or even gouvernement des juges, was the work of both political sides, as the alliance of the Federalist Marshall and the Republican Joseph Story was to show. Analogously, but differently, the introduction of proportional representation in Northern Europe was highly strategic and self-interested on the part of bourgeois parties threatened with disappearance. But it could be made legitimate easily enough. This was because the socialist parties that would lose a potential big advantage were themselves strongly committed historically to proportional representation. On normative grounds, too, this system had much to recommend it against its disproportional predecessor that was the graveyard of small parties, thus much representation. The contrast with efforts like Pinochet's and Evren's is fairly clear. In these cases, there was no question of opposition support or a general public one on empirical or normative grounds. As a great deal of comparative politics research stresses, both generals imposing semi-authoritarian constitutions sought and gained preserves of power that allowed old power holders linked to the military or the armed forces themselves to retain under new constitutions undemocratic powers and privileges gained during emergency rule. It is here that one can, strictly speaking, use the term hegemonic preservation, but the result aimed at and in the short term sustained, but the result that was aimed at and sustained in the short term had little to do with constitutionalism. As I argued over 10 years ago, there's a huge difference in principle, if not in terms of every possible device, between conversion of power and seeking guarantees against power. Conversion is an attempt to transform an older form of power under authoritarian conditions that can preserve an element of authoritarianism in a democracy, making it either a soft dictatorship, dicta blanda, or strong democracy, democratura. It is a zero-sum relationship in which the power preserved by one side does not benefit another. Guarantees against power are, on the contrary, positive sum, and yield something not only for actors and interests other than the initiators alone, and indeed also for actors who are not part of any initial bargain. Guarantees are universal as against forms of conversion that are particular. Guarantees are compatible with democracy, but push it toward its liberal interpretation. Arguably, and this is my position, they make democracy under modern conditions more rather than less democratic. Conversions make democracy less democratic. Guarantees make democracy arguably more democratic. The first important conversion I know of was by the Convention of 1795, I guess the year 3, that created a two-thirds rule for the new elections. Two-thirds of the members of the new legislature had to come from the Convention itself. Such electoral conversions reappeared in the partially unfree elections of the Soviet Union in 1989, and even in Poland later in the same year. But the more typical forms of conversion today concern the organization and supports of executive power, and they have many forms. Some openly provide reserves for authoritarian power, like militarily dominated national security councils, military courts, and special military prerogatives dealing with emergencies. Others have what has been called a bionic structure. In Chile, they gave it this name. A bionic structure having to do with appointments, often lifetime, to important constitutional bodies like courts, upper chambers, and councils of state. There are also apparently neutral institutions like the presidency that could provide holdover power only in a given context. Based on electoral surveys and the availability of a specific popular candidate, their intent is to strongly influence the immediate period after a transition. Finally, as already noticed by O'Donnell and Schmitter, there are even devices that work negatively by depriving enemies of the right to participate, as in the case of Evren's law on parties, and even the very high 10% threshold for participation he established, again in Turkey. This is admittedly a heterogeneous list, but what ties it together are agency, object, calculation, and origins. As to the first, conversion of power is the work of Herschel's hegemonic unitary agency that can retain the upper hand even in some negotiations, not only because of the reserve power of the military over violence, but as in Poland, the real or imagined role of external powers. The object of a conversion, as against a guarantee, is always particular. It will benefit only one particular group or elite, usually its original agent. In the case of conversion, the relation of means and ends must be highly determined. Not only is the goal a particular one, it is only this particular goal that can be achieved bearing an unlikely volte face by the very same actors. As to origins, it depends on types of actors involved whether conversion of power or guarantees will be sought, and if so, what type, and on the power constellation as a whole, whether conversion will be at all possible. Military juntas, whether in Chile, Turkey, or now in Egypt, have many advantages gained under unjust authoritarian regimes. Since they are not political parties or other legitimate democratic actors, during the transitions to democracy, they will be in a poor position to protect their advantages. And given past crimes, generally their persons too, unless their earlier power is converted into those of institutions that are likely to remain loyal to them. Even amnesties and property rights have no value to them unless strong institutions can enforce them. Thus, the military reservations and the bionic institutions we see affirmed and achieved in the context of both top-down and even some negotiated transitions where such forces still have the upper hand. What is crucial, however, is that the needs of liberal or potentially democratic actors can be served in other ways than through conversion of power in the forms just described. The bourgeois parties of Northern Europe had no need to establish undemocratic reservations to protect their interests. They could do so as long as the political rules of the game were changed, admittedly in their favor. Again, I call these alternative forms guarantees. Without exception, the devices involve the protection of minorities and the restriction of the power of majorities, whoever will have majority power. The typical forms are proportional representation, extensive tables of fundamental rights, entrenchment with at least medium-strong amendment rules, judicial or constitutional review, bicameralism but with different electoral rules, and without overly long-term appointments. The last two terms indicate a passive overlap. Unelected senators and judges chosen for life, and indeed the inclusion of military judges in constitutional courts like in Turkey, move these forms from guarantees toward conversion. Finally, entrenchment and strong review powers of a court, logically connected, call for a special comment. It is these features that Herschel stresses in his 4 countries and also Turkey. Yet they represent conversion only where they protect elements of conversion. Where they protect fundamental rights, on the other hand, or proportional representation, they must themselves count as guarantees. Thus, it is a serious matter that Herschel's treatment neglects the distinction between conversion and guarantees as he goes through cases. He doesn't even know that in the 4 common law countries, entrenchment and strong review protect fundamental rights above all, while in Turkey, that he also analyzes, it is a question of conditions, all of which allow the violation of rights by executive and military agencies. My conclusion to this section then is the following. Hegemonic preservation is possible and with sufficient power sustainable, but it has legitimacy problems since structurally it represents the conversion of power even when coupled with some genuine guarantees. An outcome has a much better chance to be carried out and stabilized if it is democratically legitimated, but then the question is whether we should treat it merely as elite hegemonic. If dependence on normally based acceptance by others, anti-federalists in America and socialists in Northern Europe, is fundamental, have we not stepped over the threshold from imposition to implicit negotiation? And in that case, won't negotiation be the more general method by which a constitutionalist outcome can be achieved? Implicitly, the second conception I wish to treat, the insurance model, takes a step from a single actor model and imposition to negotiation and interaction. According to Tom Ginsburg, where, and I'm quoting from him, where there are no parties that will be confident in their ability to win, all parties will prefer to limit the majority, and therefore will value minoritarian institutions such as judicial review. Unlike Adam Przeworski in an earlier analysis, Ginsburg rightly, if implicitly, includes party equality at the moment of negotiations as equivalent to electoral uncertainty afterwards. He's especially right to do so where no previous democratic elections tested the supposed equality of forces. But also, unlike Przeworski, he has not made the difference between imposition and agreement clear enough. While the discussion refers to negotiations and insists on the difference between a setting with party pluralism and another with a dominant party, it is easy to see how even the latter could be conceivably included as a special case of insurance. This would seem plausible where a dominant party is again pessimistic about its future chances, as against the other possibilities said likely by Ginsburg that they anticipate future success. A pessimistic dominant party will accordingly choose insurance. Ginsburg thus has no difficulty in citing an early version of Herschel's theory in supporting the idea of insurance. To distinguish, however, between hegemonic preservation and insurance theories, the already introduced contrast between conversion and guarantee should be kept in mind. It can be historically shown that ruling parties or elites, whether in Chile, Hungary, or South Africa, or the Soviet Union, when it existed, prefer conversion. And this is always the main element of insurance in their first constitutional proposals. Whether in Hungary or South Africa, these ruling parties are forced to abandon such schemes under pressure. the impossibility to legitimate a scheme to important actors in a country or outside, and or the unwillingness of new forces to accept them. When on the contrary, we see insurance presented in terms of guarantees, as in Israel and Canada among Herschel's cases, and Hungary and South Africa in both Herschel and Ginsburg, we are right to suspect a plurality of negotiating actors behind the scheme. Conversely, a plurality of roughly equal actors could not produce conversion of the powers of one previously dominant elite. Admittedly, a very few dominant actors in the exclusionary types of pact stressed by O'Donnell and Schmitter may produce multiple conversion in terms of corporatist or narrowly consociationist bargains. But they have rightly depicted these as taking place before what they call the upsurge of civil society. After that upsurge that may take place before any negotiations, as in Central Europe and South Africa, such bargains are either not possible or they do not tend to hold. Hegemonic preservation is real and possible, but only where a dominant actor or actors can impose elements of exclusionary power conversion. This is already a principal difference between hegemonic preservation and insurance. But a deeper difference is even more important. Any reader of Jaworski's early version or Ginsburg's current one will recognize the shadow of John Rawls's veil of ignorance behind insurance theory. As a matter of fact, since the actual motives of the actors are generally unknown, we are in fact dealing with just the type of imputation from results that Rawls himself practiced. Accordingly, the actors act because they are, or as if they were, unable to anticipate what their future advantage might be, and are therefore able, or are willing, to rely only on principled arguments to support their positions. While specific future minorities may indeed need protection under constitutionalism, the main actors will argue that all minorities will have the same need. And this is a valid argument. Whatever the motive, and it is important enough though rarely actually known, the validity of the argument and its consequences cannot be reduced to it. Plausibly, reconstructible as the veil of ignorance, the insurance theory has normative as well as empirical foundations. Where there is hegemonic preservation, on the other hand, characterized by conversion of power, realpolitik replaces normative argumentation. We establish these future preserves of power because we can and need to and want to. Given relative certainty about the future, as depicted by Herschel, incumbent advantage is used to block the consequences of that future. Born of certainty rather than uncertainty, hegemonic preservation seeks to make part of the future different, but even more certain, to the advantage of self-serving incumbents. Insurance, on the other hand, even when linked to relative certainty about the future, as in the case of the Indian Congress Party in 1948, acts as if there was uncertainty, and in such a way as to help make the future actually less certain. After all, that is what fair electoral systems do. No one can predict, for example, with any certainty that a dominant party itself may not split, as it happened in the Indian case actually, and may yet, hopefully, happen in South Africa too. Similarly, the protection of enforceable rights can benefit minorities and individuals who have not even appeared on the scene. Conversion, as already argued, involves no universal perspectives and is less conducive to a shift and transformation in the object served by the relevant institutions. Given dictatorship as a starting point, conversion helps to produce a semi-authoritarian or semi-democratic system, as already said. Only sheer traditionalism, and that's the main point here, can support it ideologically, or perhaps a national security rationale. Democratic or liberal ideologies cannot justify the naming of bionic officials for a given purpose or the establishment of institutional preserves for unaccountable and uncontrollable bodies. As Jaworski indicates, solutions born as functions only of a given power constellation, in effect Rawls's modus vivendi, tend to last only as long as that constellation remains secure. This is so unless an overlapping consensus emerges, but that is not possible in the case of conversion, only in the case of guarantees. Of course, nothing would stop a currently hegemonic party turning liberal democratic and making the same arguments as those seeking insurance and guarantees honestly or not. We disregard democratic motivation in the name of some kind of rational choice Occam's razor only at our intellectual peril. But in all cases where the outcome is constitutionalist, we are right to suspect some pluralism behind a monolithic appearance, whether in India, whose constitution-making process is so well explored by Granville Austin, or even Israel, where Herschel passingly mentioned that behind the old Ashkenazim elite that was the agent of the constitutional revolution, so-called, were the forces from Likud, Labor, and Meretz. If you know these three parties, they were the most right-wing and the most left-wing party at the time. Pluralism in negotiating settings thus turns out to be more important even than uncertainty about the future. After all, there are many actors that may be uncertain about a predictable future or be certain and in error concerning an unpredictable one. In both cases, they can present themselves to have acted under uncertainty. Pluralism contributes to the production and the appearance pluralism contributes to the production and appearance of uncertainty and indeed to future uncertainty. Yes, in India in 1948, future short-term electoral results were predictable, if not entirely certain. Yet the result was the attainment of guarantees. This shows that the insurance theory is best understood as a combination of real need for insurance and ideal commitment to an order where there are guarantees. Which of the two is more important in a given context, motive or principle, is itself an empirical question. Weber's ideals and interests are always present, but in different combinations and proportions. As Ginsburg and Przeworski both periodically recognize, without noting the inconsistency with their method relying on a version of Occam's razor, Denkökonomie in German, the international importance and dissemination of the principles and institutions of constitutionalism since the 1990s itself can have motive-forming power in national settings. Thus, the insurance theory, as relinked to Rawls's theory of legitimacy, represents the best hope for constitutionalism as an outcome. What is its relation to what in these lectures I call the legal models or paradigms of constitution making? Ginsburg and co-authors, when examining such methods, come up with very scant and I think misleading conclusions that I will not discuss now due to lack of time. He and the others do not even consider separately the two-stage method perfected in South Africa that, along with the American forerunner, were earlier pronounced by Ginsburg in his own book as textbook cases of insurance. Now, neither the doubly differentiated American convention is distinguished from constituent assemblies of the sovereign type, nor is the round table treated as distinct from constitution making through normal legislatures. With distinctions not made, the question is not asked, and thus the right answer cannot follow. The gap between abstract theory and cases, description and recommendation has not been filled. I have no great confidence that such a gap can be filled, along with a definitive test for the insurance theory by a study relying on large samples, even a better chosen and more differentiated one by these authors. What I think can be shown is the internal relations of process and result demonstrated by thoroughly considered comparative cases. In this sense, the insurance theory expanded by stress on inclusion and participation as well, but as separate categories, can be linked to process, serving as a link in the argument concerning outcome and stability. As a preliminary step, I would like to already admit that given this theory's abstractness, even when expanded with concepts of legitimacy, different types of constitution making can satisfy its results. But today I want to argue that the paradigm of constitution making presented here as the multi-stage post-sovereign one has the best chances of satisfying the conditions of insurance and legitimacy. First, and this is not insignificant, leaving aside Rawls, whose construction was purely hypothetical, the insurance theory emerged historically in the midst of a series of mostly post-revolutionary changes of regime in Southern Europe, Latin America, and finally Central Europe. Its first traces are in Przeworski's definition of democracy as uncertainty, and in O'Donnell's and Schmitter's rehabilitation of pacts as methods of democratic transition. As already noted, the developed conception is in Przeworski's 1991 Democracy and the Market that was directly influenced by events and outcomes surrounding the Polish Roundtable of 1989. Interestingly, this context produced some steps backward, where O'Donnell and Schmitter considered negotiated pacts to be much more likely road to democracy than the via revolutionaria. Przeworski stressed the likelihood of what I call conversion in pacts of extrication. Today, after Hungary, Bulgaria, and South Africa, we can see, however, that what has been called extrication need not be highly exclusionary nor involve conversion of power. The guarantees posited by Przeworski for a route he linked to authoritarian collapse, and thus negotiations only among new actors, can be attained in negotiations with the forces of the old regime. Indeed, aside from military power holders, it certainly seems to be possible to negotiate full constitutionalism with incumbents and beneficiaries of old regimes. The paradoxical result, already glimpsed at by O'Donnell and Schmitter, is that it is better for democracy to negotiate with old regime actors when it is at all possible than to fully overthrow them. The revolutionary elimination of old actors may be unavoidable, of course, but then the danger is also very present that we may very well replace one imposition by the next. Next, what the expanded insurance theory tells us is not just any negotiations will do. First, they have to be inclusive. Second, their inevitably elitist character needs to be diminished. Third, full democratic legitimacy can only be attained if the final outcome is made dependent on elections. All this leads to a two- or multi-stage process preoccupied with the problem of legitimacy. Let me show how this works. Why the first negotiated stage? Assuming even that entirely neutral electoral formula can be achieved, inclusivity may not be the result of elections, especially where a great movement like Solidarity or the ANC has long incorporated popular aspirations. Constitutionalist constitutions in a narrow insurance model could admittedly be the work of two great forces, each uncertain about the future. In the expanded insurance model, though, stressing inclusion for the sake of legitimacy, these should be the work of all those representing significant segments of opinion and interest. This only a constructed rather than elected framework of negotiations can accomplish, at least reliably, since occasionally a radical proportional representation could have the same result. But when constructing a negotiating round table, the criterion of inclusion becomes even more important. While an election may legitimately deny representation to some, a construction does not have that advantage. Starting with an old ruling party or elite, there would be great advantage for the sect to have only one partner, and if that is impossible, to exclude the most radical elements of the opposition. While the exclusion of radicals is more likely than not disadvantageous to the opposition side, such efforts, and this is the main point, cannot easily be made legitimate. Whether in Hungary or South Africa, the Fidesz in Hungary and Inkatha and the white extreme right in South Africa, assuming the existence of multiple organizations, the logic of greater inclusion is difficult to resist. It may be true that all constitution making involves some plurality and some negotiation, as Przeworski and Elkins and the others stress. The paradigm proposes here, however, implies inclusive negotiations that may have been confirmed even in the problematic survey models of the scholars that I'm referring to. But construction of a negotiating framework implies still an elite-driven process. Even a greater inclusion diminishes this aspect. Moreover, inclusion cannot be perfect given the emergence of new actors in a democratizing context. Negotiated solutions are inevitably, always with some justice, denounced as exclusionary. The gap between empirical and ideal veil of ignorance, moreover, is always real. Even when parties do not know what would really benefit them, they choose what is likely to be advantageous only to them, and those outside, practicing the hermeneutics of suspicion, always notice or at least suspect that this is the case. Both the veil of ignorance and exclusion gaps thus need to be diminished further. An opening to the public sphere and its inputs helps. Jon Elster is right. The American framers, when compared to the French between 1789 and 1791, may have been helped to make needed compromises by the secrecy of their proceedings. The Polish Magdalenka and the South African Bosperaden partially confirm this claim, as does the absence of publicity from all but a few plenary sessions in Hungary. In the last case, however, the exclusion of the public, linked to a secret deal about the presidency, tended to delegitimate the Round Table agreements till a referendum confirmed and corrected this gap. Thus, the linking of what may be inevitably secret to public sessions and information and possibly popular participation in the result may still be very important in imposing public regarding arguments on the participants and increasing the weight of principle against motive and interest in the proceedings. While democratic elections should not be in the beginning of this process, they are nevertheless indispensable. The public sphere normally does not exert power, but only influence, and the referendum is a blunt instrument easily challenged, as the Hungarian case referred to actually shows. The final constitutional product should not be made by a combination of old regime actors along with co-opted and self-selected representatives, even with the help of a referendum. Thus, democratic elections for a constitution-making assembly are mandatory, at least midway in the process. The first problem, then, is how such elections are to be organized, and the second, how the two or more stages are to be interlinked. A negotiated interim constitution is the solution to both problems. It can both provide for all the fair conditions of democratic elections and specify how much of the negotiated solutions must be preserved in the final constitution or altered only under restrictive and enforceable conditions. Thus, an interim constitution can and should establish rules for final constitution making, limiting the sovereignty of the decisive constitution making body, as well as incentives and penalties motivating its members to finish the job. Finally, as we have seen in Iraq and Nepal, full legal continuity with an old regime, though potentially important for producing security and predictability, is not an absolutely necessary condition for this paradigm. But legality and its enforcement are all the more important for the process once it has begun. The interim constitution will be useless along with the previous agreements if they are not enforced. Thus, the Hungarian and South African examples of establishing strong constitutional courts already in the interim constitution is necessarily part of the developed model. From the legitimation point of view, this lends the process as well as result a constitutionalist character. As the Hungarian Constitutional Court stated, the rule of law can only be created through the rule of law. Beginning with the veil of ignorance and the insurance model, adding inclusion, publicity, democracy, and legality may seem to be simply adding arbitrary legitimation principles to the model. While adding additional symbolic resources like charisma may be arbitrary, though useful for the process of negotiations and the stability of the results, the principles stressed here are logically interconnected rather than arbitrary. As a legitimating framework, the veil of ignorance is not reducible to some actor's ignorance or sense of uncertainty. Empirical ignorance is only relative ignorance, and it is always suspected. And even a relatively inclusive bargain is exclusive. There is always imposition too, as Max Weber stressed. How can this imposition be legitimated? Bringing in more actors? Such an inclusionary process on the level of political society has its limits. Thus, the only ways of including many others, actual and potential, are through the influence of civil society and the accountability of elections. The negotiating actors must know, and this is what publicity does, is that they may have to face popular protests and mobilization if their constitutional projects are too incumbent protecting or in other ways misguided. And they must know that the sanction of elections is available if the interim constitution does not provide for an increasingly legitimate process. Initial constitution making can fail, but most actors involved would like to make it succeed. While the long-term success may or may not be linked to initial legitimacy, short-term one certainly depends on it to an important extent. To attain it, the process must rely on additional legitimating principles than just the uncertainty and the ignorance of the makers. Among these, publicity, democracy, and legality are the most essential as well as the most attractive. Thank you very much.